there and welcome back for our next video on APUS history. Today we are tackling the first part of topic 4.4, America on the world stage, specifically looking at military actions in this period. You can go ahead and click down in the description below to grab some follow along notes as we go through the video. So our learning objective for this lesson is to explain how and why American foreign policy developed and expanded over time. So what we're looking at here is key concept 4.3, and it's all about how the U.S. government tried to control the Western Hemisphere, and we're tackling just this first part through military actions. So we've got quite the outline today. We're going to do a little historical context, talk about Jefferson and foreign affairs that transitioned to Madison, and then dive into the War of 1812. So let's first just do a quick review of what we've talked about so far with the Louisiana Purchase. So we talked about how the Louisiana Purchase it was the process of the U.S. taking over the territory that had been owned by both France and Spain at different times. This doubles the size of the United States. It leads to significant westward expansion, conflict with American Indians, and new boundaries that are going to be contended. Additionally, what is important to understand is the election of 1804. Now, while Jefferson won by an overwhelming margin, it's not to say that there wasn't some conflict. So Aaron Burr had been Jefferson's vice president in the first term, but he was not nominated for vice president by the Democratic Republicans for Jefferson's second term. And so he ends up doing a few things that are pretty intense, I guess. And so one thing he does is he tries to form a secret pact with some New England Federalists. He tries to become the governor of New York, and then he had planned to secede. That doesn't end up happening. He also challenges Hamilton to a duel where he fatally shoots him. And then later he ends up trying to take Mexico from Spain, or planning to take Mexico from Spain, and then ruling over that entire territory himself. He ended up being tried and acquitted for treason. So just because Jefferson wins by a significant majority doesn't mean that there wasn't conflict within the party. So now we're going to dive into Jefferson and foreign policy. One of the first things he deals with as president is going to be the Barbary pirates. And so what we are talking about is these North African countries that had become known for the ways that they were plundering merchant ships. They would often take captive the crews and then hold them for ransom or sell them into slavery. And so European countries, to avoid these ransom charges, they would pay tribute to these nations, and then that country's ships would not be attacked by the pirates. So Presidents Washington and Adams had agreed to that same process of paying tribute. However, when Jefferson came into power, the leader of Tripoli had required a higher sum than Jefferson wanted to pay. And so he refused and actually sends the military. And so this is a departure from the foreign policy that had been done by Washington and Adams. While it wasn't an official declared war, there was sporadic fighting, and the U.S. was never officially victorious, but did earn some foreign respect in this process. Much more significantly, part of Jefferson's presidency is going to deal with challenges with Britain. And so if you remember, going back to our 1700s, the U.S. has been dealing with impressment. The British are capturing American sailors and forcing them to serve in the British Navy. And this was in large part because the U.S. had decided to maintain neutrality between the most recent skirmish between Britain and France. Additionally, in 1807, a British warship, actually just off the coast of Virginia, shoots at a U.S. warship, killing some Americans and then capturing others. And Jefferson's response is to try to maintain U.S. neutrality. So even though there begins to be calls for war, Jefferson does not believe the U.S. can handle another war against Britain so soon after the Revolutionary War. So instead, he does what's called the Embargo Act. This is where he prohibits trade. He does not allow merchant ships to leave for foreign ports. And he believed this would force European nations to respect American neutrality. Instead, the European nations just do fine. They do just fine without American trade, and it brings significant hardship to the United States. It was so terrible that he actually repeals it. He calls for the repeal before he leaves office in 1809. So here are some of the specifics. Looking especially at the effects here. We see no significant effect of the Embargo Act on British markets. However, if you look at the effects on American shipping, we see prices and earnings falling, shipping industries devastated, existing markets wrecked, unemployment increased, so on and so forth. And so the effects are very widespread, especially in areas like New England. Here you can see is another example where you can see a foreign trade just going plummeting as the Embargo Act is put into effect. And then a very popular political cartoon here that many students misinterpret. But what you've got here is, if you see, oh, grab me there, that is embargo backwards. And so you can see that there is conflict, opposition rising up against the Embargo Act. So next up is the election of 1808. Jefferson decides to voluntarily retire, and he and the Democratic Republicans will select James Madison to replace him. Now, James Madison had a few credentials that made him a good choice. He had been Secretary of State for Jefferson, and the Secretary of State is really in charge of foreign affairs. And so that was a logical choice, being that the U.S. was having these deep conflicts with the Barbary pirates and also with Britain. He also is known as the father of the Constitution, and so he was very influential in the formation of the American government. Now, because of the Embargo Act and really frustration over that financial impact, we do see the election of more Federalists into congressional seats. And so we see a little more divided government in the election of 1808 and the years after that. So when Madison becomes president, he is going to try to continue neutrality. And so in the face of continuing challenges, he is going to try to prevent war. So one of these continued challenges is going to be the frontier conflict. And so as the U.S. continued to move west and encroach on American Indian lands, we see an American Indian leader, Tecumseh, and his brother, who was more of a prophet, attempt to oppose these encroachments onto their lands. And what they do is they try to form a pan-Indian resistance. And so here's a quote when Tecumseh is calling for a collective response by Indians against the Americans that are moving west. So what he says is, "The being within, communing with past ages, tells me that once nor until lately there was no white man on this continent, that it was then all belonged to red men, children of the same parents, placed on it by the great spirit that made them, to keep it, to traverse it, to enjoy its productions, and to fill it with the same race, once a happy race, since made miserable by the white people, who are never contented, but always encroaching. The way and the only way to check and to stop this evil is for all the red men to unite in claiming a common and equal right in the land, as it was at first and should be yet. For it never was divided, but belongs to all for the use of each." So really you can see there how he's calling for American Indians to ally together and prevent white Americans from further stealing native lands. So what happens is the British end up actually supporting and aiding Tecumseh in his resistance to U.S. efforts at expansion. And General William Henry Harrison, a future president, ends up destroying Tecumseh's efforts in the Battle of Tippecanoe. But this furthers conflict with Britain because it became apparent that Britain had been supporting American Indians. Another challenge that Madison has to deal with is this new group of congressmen called war hawks. So two of the more famous ones are Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. Many of them were young and from the Western territories that were now states, and they were eager for war with Britain. You can think about how that frontier conflict especially affected their states. They believed that war was the only way to defend American honor, gain Canada, and destroy the American Indian frontier resistance. So all of this led to calls for war, and Madison is going to try to resist. In 1809, he creates what's called, or he supports the Non-Intercourse Act, it was a lesser version of the Embargo Act. It would allow foreign trade except with Britain and France. And then in 1810, the government agrees to restore trade with Britain and France if they formally agree to respect U.S. neutrality. Now, they may formally agree to that. They don't, in fact, actually do it. And so what happens is Madison, he requests Congress to declare war against Britain on June 1st. And there you can see is the chart, or a table really, of the states that were voting for and against the War of 1812. And what you'll notice is that southern and western territories or states were much more likely to support the war effort. And New England states were more opposed. Remember, this is where more of our Federalists were. They began to call it Mr. Madison's War versus this collective attitude, this national support for the war. And some of the reasons why they opposed the war was because after the Embargo Act was repealed, they were making profits again. The economic crisis had been averted, and impressment they viewed as more of a minor inconvenience than a reason to go to war. And they believed that this was more of a ploy for Democratic Republicans to become dominant by expanding into territories like Canada and Florida that would further support for the Democratic Republican Party. And so we see this division really apparent in the election of 1812. You can see that even though James Madison handily wins, you see that it is very apparent that the New England states have a different idea of how the country should be won. So we do have war declared in 1812, and there is an attempt by the U.S. to invade Canada, but that is easily repulsed. And then there's a bunch of naval battles. One of the things that plays in the advantage of the U.S. Army at this time in military is that Britain was still at war with France for the first couple years of the war, and so they were more concerned about that war than the War of 1812. And that allows for the American military to ramp up in order to actually fight against the British again. So there are some naval victories that are interesting if you have time to read about. A Captain Oliver Hazard Perry has an interesting story of how he his ship was going down, and he took another somehow commandeered another ship and used it to ram into the British, something like that. Look up Oliver Hazard Perry if you're interested. But anyways, near the end of the war, the British will actually burn down the White House and Capitol buildings, and the U.S. troops led by General Andrew Jackson are going to they are going to war against American Indians in the West and are going to be very ruthless in eliminating their control over some southern areas. So by the end of 1814, Britain is weary of war, and Madison recognizes that Americans will not win decisively. And so they come to a peace agreement on Christmas Eve of 1814, where they decided, we're going to stop fighting. We're going to have a truce. All territory that had been gained during the war will go back to the original owner. The boundary that was between Canada and the U.S. at the start of the war will be the same. And they don't address the grievances of impressment or the instigation of American Indians on the frontier. All of that just isn't addressed. But still, the Senate ratifies the treaty in early January of 1815. And after the treaty is ratified, the Battle of New Orleans takes place. So Jackson down in New Orleans had not heard about the treaty yet, and he overwhelmingly defeated the British. You can look up the casualties there. Now, this battle ends up being meaningless because the treaty had been signed, but it does fuel American nationalism. Americans believe that they are winning the war. These events are happening so close together that Americans associate this massive victory with the treaty, thinking that now for the second time, America has beat the British. Now, another thing happening at the same time is what's called the Hartford Convention. This is a secret assembly of Federalists in Hartford, Connecticut. And now they were very opposed to the war and they were very angry over the Democratic Republican leadership for the last, 14 years. And so they draft protests, they draft amendments, and they end up, a few radical Federalists say New England is going to secede as a last resort. New England will secede if this doesn't work, if you don't start to make changes to meet our needs. So the final report is issued in January and read before Congress. But because the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed, it really made the Federalists look unpatriotic, that they weren't willing to support the nation through this struggle against Britain. The party is so weakened by the criticisms that 1816 will be the last election with a Federalist candidate. Here is another political cartoon where the three men up above are different states, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, and they're like debating whether they should take the leap into the monarch of Britain's arms, the king's arms here. So there you can see some criticism over their action and being more loyal to Britain than to the United States. So what's the legacy of the war? It's kind of funny. Before I became a social studies teacher, I used to talk about some pointless things in history, like why would we need to know the War of 1812? Who wants to learn the War of 1812? And now I actually really enjoy teaching it. So what is the legacy? Well, one thing is it begins to shift the reputation of the United States around the world. And so this begins to gain some additional respect from European nations that will be evident in our next lesson as well. We see the boundary with Canada basically being finalized, and so solving that boundary dispute. We see that there begins to be this era of good feelings, as some people call it, this time of increased nationalism and unity in the nation, which we'll talk about again in our next lesson. But one reason for this is that the Federalist Party ends. We end up only having one political party, the Democratic Republicans, for some time, about a decade there. But some other ideas that are more similar to the sectional crisis is the secession that was discussed with New England. And that sets the precedent for the South in future years. We also see an increase in industrialization as a result of the economic changes that happened. We see the growth of frontier people like Andrew Jackson becoming war heroes and eventual presidents. And we see the forcing of the surrender of American Indian lands. And that is a main topic that we are going to continue to talk about throughout this unit. So I hope this lesson was really helpful in understanding how foreign policy changed and shifted, how it went from neutrality to using the military, because that is a really important concept for this unit. So I hope it was helpful for you. And if so, please like and subscribe.